Her 60-foot azimuth, christened the Queen Bee, with all the subtlety of a foghorn, churned into my private cove, scattering $1,000 of custom lures, and nearly swamping my anchored skiff. Brenda Sterling, HOA president and self-appointed empress of our little coastal town, leaned over the rail, sunglasses hiding nothing of her disdain. "This unsightly fishing paraphernalia needs to be cleared, Mr. Henderson. It's an eyesore," she gestured vaguely. "Oh, regulations." What she didn't know, as she idled her behemoth over my carefully cultivated oyster beds, a legacy from my father, was that her precious yacht was currently trespassing in the waters of a marina I happened to own. And I was about to regulate her. The churn of her twin props was a declaration of war, a casual desecration of a place that was more than just property. It was sanctuary, memory, a living testament to a quieter way of life she clearly found offensive. Her voice, amplified by the natural acoustics of the cove, grated like barnacles on a hull. "And those marker buoys? Unapproved structures. I'll be issuing a citation." I remained silent, letting the outboard on my skiff gently rock me. My hands, calloused from years of hauling lines and mending nets, and more recently, signing checks and reviewing contracts, remained steady on the gunwales. Anger was a current, best navigated with a firm rudder, not raw emotion. She mistook my stillness for acquiescence, a common error among her kind. "I expect compliance by tomorrow, Henderson, or the association will take steps." Steps. Such a quaint word for what usually amounted to bureaucratic bludgeoning and fines designed to crush dissent. I watched her, a woman whose entire domain of perceived power ended at the high tide mark of her own manicured lawn, now attempting to extend her reign into the sovereign territory of the sea, specifically, my sea. The irony was a bitter amuse-bouche. My mind was already cataloging the violations: trespass, property damage, potential environmental impact on the oyster beds, reckless operation of a vessel. Each a clear, actionable offense under maritime law, light years beyond the grasp of her petty HOA bylaws. I let a slow breath out. The first step was always observation, assessment. She had provided ample material for both. "Noted, Mrs. Sterling," I said, my voice deliberately calm, devoid of the fury that simmered beneath. Let her think she'd won this little skirmish. The war, however, would be fought on my terms, in an arena where her HOA presidency meant less than a forgotten mooring line. She gave a curt, satisfied nod, then barked an order to someone unseen on her vessel. The Queen Bee's engines roared, and it began a clumsy wide turn, its wake further eroding the fragile shoreline of my cove. My cove, my marina, her mistake. The Queen Bee, for all its bulk and bluster, was now berthed at Slip at 12, a premium spot in Henderson Marina, my marina. Skipper, my dockmaster, a wiry ex-Coast Guard comm specialist with a penchant for conspiracy theories that were alarmingly accurate about 50% of the time, was already on it before I even tied up my skiff. "Boss," he greeted me, tablet in hand. "Got some lovely footage of Her Majesty's Royal Entry, time-stamped, geotagged, plus multiple angles of the, navigational critique she offered your fishing gear." He swiped through images, the yacht's hull numbers, clear shots of Brenda on deck, the churned water over the oyster beds, my scattered lures looking like colorful casualties of an oil spill. Damage assessment on the oyster bed will take a bit, but visually, it's significant. "And your custom Lucky Lucy jig? Looks like it got a propeller kiss." I nodded. "Skipper, I want a full inventory of damages to my personal equipment. Separately, assess any damage to the cove's ecosystem markers and the shoreline. Compile it with the footage. We're going formal." His grin was feral. Formal as in cease and desist formal, or see you in court, and by the way, your boat's now a reef formal. "Start with trespass and demand for damages," I said. "Deliver it to the Queen Bee. Personal service. Get a signature if you can. Refusal noted if you can't." I then walked him through the broader strategy. Brenda Sterling had been a low-grade infection in our community for years. Her HOA was a fiefdom built on the fear of fines for grass a quarter-inch too long, or the wrong shade of beige on a mailbox. She'd terrorized homeowners, driven down property values with her draconian enforcement, and generally made life miserable for anyone who didn't bow to her paper-crowned authority. My own home, thankfully on the outskirts of her designated tyranny zone, had only suffered minor skirmishes. A passive-aggressive note about the rustic nature of my lobster traps stored neatly by my shed. But this invasion of my cove, this was different. This wasn't just an overreach, it was a fundamental violation of property and peace, an act of such entitled arrogance, it demanded a commensurate response. My father had taught me two things: how to read the water and how to deal with bullies. Both required patience, observation, and decisive action when the tide turned. The tide was turning. Skipper was already tapping away, drafting the initial salvo. "You know, boss," he said without looking up, Article 4, Section B of the Marina Terms and Conditions. Vessels causing damage to private or marina property may be subject to immediate berthing suspension and financial lien. Just saying. I allowed myself a small cold smile. Patience, Skipper. We lay the groundwork first. Let her feel the sting of ordinary law before she discovers she's moored in the hornet's nest. Brenda Sterling received the legal envelope from Skipper with an expression that suggested he'd handed her a live crab. He reported back that she'd initially refused it, stating, "I don't deal with marina staff on HOA matters." Skipper, ever the professional, had calmly informed her it was a legal notification regarding her vessel, the Queen Bee, and her actions that morning within the privately owned Henderson Cove, not an HOA communiqué. He'd added helpfully, "Refusal of service will be duly noted, ma'am, but it doesn't make the contents go away. In fact, it often makes things a tad more escalated." She'd snatched it then, her face a mask of affronted dignity. Her reaction, when it came, was predictable. Not a phone call, not a lawyer's polite inquiry. Instead, a new, crisp, white notice appeared pinned to my workshop door the next morning. An official HOA violation notice regarding unapproved coastal structures and commercial fishing activity in a residential zone, Henderson Cove. It cited various non-existent bylaws, demanded the immediate removal of all fishing detritus, and threatened daily fines of $200. It was signed with a flourish by Brenda Sterling, President Seaview Palms Homeowners Association. The sheer, unadulterated gall was almost breathtaking. She was trying to apply her land-based HOA rules to my private, commercially zoned marina property and its adjacent cove, an area explicitly outside her jurisdiction. It was like a parking attendant trying to ticket a ship in international waters. I photographed the notice, carefully removed it, and filed it under B for brazen idiocy. My lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, whose demeanor made a glacier look warm and fuzzy, had already reviewed Skipper's evidence. His only comment via email had been, "Ample grounds. Proceed as discussed." That discussion had covered a phased approach, a slow tightening of the legal and financial net. The initial demand letter was step one, designed to be dismissed. It was bait, and Brenda had taken it, then doubled down with her own pathetic countermove. My inner monologue was a calm recitation of facts and consequences. She believes her HOA position grants her omnipotence. She is wrong. She believes her wealth insulates her from accountability. She is wrong. She believes my silence is weakness. She will learn, painfully, that it is the quiet before the storm. I instructed Skipper to ignore the HOA notice completely. Our next communication, I told him, will be from the marina itself, citing her violations of our terms of service. Let's see how the Queen Bee enjoys being grounded by the entity providing her current, very expensive, parking spot. The game had levels, and Brenda was still fumbling on the tutorial while I was already planning the endgame. Her HOA notice was a child's crayon drawing in a world of legally binding oil paintings. The second envelope delivered to the Queen Bee was heavier, bearing the Henderson Marina logo. Inside, a meticulously detailed letter outlined Brenda Sterling's breaches of the Marina Berth Holders Agreement, Section 3.2, reckless operation of a vessel within Marina-controlled waters. Her entry into my Cove, Section 4.1, damage to Marina property and adjacent private holdings, the oyster beds, and my equipment. And Section 7.5, conduct unbecoming and creation of nuisance, her general demeanor and unauthorized assertion of authority. The letter informed her that, pending resolution of the damages claimed in the previous legal notice, which she had clearly ignored, her marina privileges were under review, and her vessel was now subject to daily surcharges for non-compliant berthing. A copy of the marina's fee schedule for such infractions was helpfully attached. It was not insignificant. I envisioned her reading it, the words slowly penetrating her self-imposed bubble of importance. This wasn't some vague HOA threat about the color of her petunias. This was about her multi-million-dollar toy and its ability to float freely. Skipper confirmed delivery. She actually read this one standing on the dock, boss. Face went through 3 different shades of purple. Then she started yelling about calling her lawyer. Said something about harassment and abuse of power. Rich, coming from her. I almost felt a flicker of something akin to pity. Almost. But it was extinguished by the memory of her casual destruction in my Cove, the generations of care she'd dismissed with a wave of her hand. My father's voice echoed in my mind. A lesson learned young. Son, some people only understand the language of consequences. Make sure you speak it fluently. My legal strategy was not about vengeance, not entirely. It was about re-establishing boundaries, about demonstrating that power, real power, wasn't about a plastic badge and a rulebook full of petty restrictions. It was about ownership, responsibility, and the quiet, unshakable authority that came with them. Brenda was about to learn that the rules of the sea and the rules of my marina had sharper teeth than any HOA covenant. The beauty of it was its clinical precision. No raised voices, no public spectacle from my end, just the steady, relentless application of documented facts and contractual obligations. Each step was a turn of the screw, a tightening of the vise. Her HOA was a sandbox. She had wandered into a shipyard, and the machinery was just beginning to whir to life. The inner commentary was almost soothing, a litany of process. Step 1. Establish trespass. Step 2. Document damages. Step 3. Issue demand. Step 4. Counter illegitimate authority with legitimate authority. Step 5. Apply contractual leverage. Each beat was a nail in the coffin of her arrogance. The first tangible consequence for Brenda Sterling arrived not as a letter, but as a polite yet firm conversation with Skipper. He informed her, per my instructions and Section 9.1 of the Marina Agreement, suspension of services for accounts in arrears or vessels in violation, that her access to shore power and fresh water was being temporarily suspended. Fueling services, naturally, were also now unavailable to the Queen Bee until the outstanding matters, namely, the damage claim and the accumulating non-compliance fees, were addressed. She tried to pull the "Do you know who I am?" card, boss, Skipper reported, barely concealing his amusement. I told her, "Yes, ma'am, you're the owner of the vessel in Slip at 12, currently in significant breach of marina regulations. Would you like a copy of the regulations again?" Her bluster, he said, deflated somewhat, replaced by a sputtering indignation. The daily fines were indeed accruing. They were designed not just to compensate but to irritate, a constant drip of financial discomfort. Brenda, I knew, was wealthy, but few enjoyed watching money drain away due to their own stubbornness, especially when it was accompanied by the slow strangulation of amenities. The real leverage, however, wasn't just financial. It was the dawning realization on her part that her usual tactics, intimidation, invoking the HOA, relying on her social standing, were utterly ineffective here. She was on my turf, governed by my rules, and those rules were backed by contract law, not the flimsy authority of a neighborhood committee. I started to hear whispers around the marina. Other boat owners, many of whom were also long-suffering members of her HOA, began to watch the unfolding drama with a mixture of fear and poorly concealed glee. Brenda had apparently tried to rally some of them to her cause, complaining about the tyrannical marina owner. It backfired spectacularly. One old salt, whose sailboat had been subjected to a barrage of HOA complaints about the unapproved color of his canvas boom cover, reportedly told her, "Brenda, you poked the wrong damn bear. This ain't about lawn gnomes anymore." Pops, my grizzled mentor, who still kept a small trawler at the marina and offered unsolicited but usually sage advice, found me inspecting the temporary repairs to the Cove's markers. "Heard you're giving Queenie the squeeze," he rumbled, a twinkle in his eye. "Some folks, they only learn respect when their anchor chain gets tangled in the propeller of justice." He spat into the water. "Good on you, son. That Cove. Your daddy loved that spot." His words reinforced the deeper current beneath my actions. This wasn't just business. It was legacy. It was about protecting something that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. Brenda's arrogance had violated more than just a property line. The pressure was building. Her yacht, once a symbol of her status, was slowly becoming a very expensive, very inconvenient prison. And she was the one holding the keys to her own release. If only she'd swallow her pride and acknowledge the damage she'd done. But pride, I suspected, was a cargo she'd find very difficult to jettison. Brenda Sterling finally broke. Not with a call from her lawyer, as I'd half expected, but with a personal appearance at the Marina office. She stormed in, face flushed, clutching a handful of Marina notices, like accusations. Skipper, who was manning the front desk, merely raised an eyebrow. I was in the back, going over fuel inventory reports, but her voice carried. "I demand to speak to Mr. Henderson. This harassment has to stop." I walked out slowly, deliberately calm. "Mrs. Sterling," I said, my tone even. "You wish to speak with me?" She launched into a tirade. It was a masterpiece of entitled fury, a verbal gish gallop of accusations. I was abusing my position, engaging in a vendetta, trying to ruin her reputation. She even threatened to have the HOA investigate the marina's zoning compliance, a threat so ludicrously impotent, it was almost comical. I let her vent, watching her carefully. The power dynamic in the room was palpable. She, accustomed to being the one dishing out orders and threats, was now on the receiving end of unyielding, quiet authority. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke. "Mrs. Sterling," I began, my voice low but carrying the weight of all the carefully laid legal groundwork. "Let us be very clear. You are here because you piloted your vessel, the Queen Bee, into my private, clearly marked cove. In doing so, you caused significant, documented damage to my personal property and to the sensitive marine environment of those oyster beds. You were formally notified of this trespass and the damages. You chose to ignore it." I gestured to the papers in her hand. "Subsequently, you were notified of violations of the Henderson Marina Berth Holders Agreement, which you signed. These violations stem directly from your actions and your refusal to address the initial damage claim. The daily surcharges and suspension of services are standard procedure, outlined in the agreement you freely entered into." Her face was tightening, the bluster fading into a dawning, horrified understanding. "This isn't harassment, Mrs. Sterling. This is accountability. You seem to believe that the rules which govern others do not apply to you. Here, in this marina, and in matters concerning my private property, you are mistaken." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "The path to resolving this is straightforward. Acknowledge the damage, make restitution as per the itemized claim, and settle the accrued marina fees. Upon satisfaction of these terms, your services will be restored, and your vessel will be free to depart. Refuse, and the consequences will continue to escalate, strictly according to the legal frameworks you have serially ignored." She stared at me, speechless for perhaps the first time in her adult life. The trap so carefully set had sprung. It wasn't a cage of steel bars but one of contracts, laws, and her own intractable pride. The poetic justice was that her belief in the absolute power of rules was now being used to dismantle her. The rules were just bigger, older, and more firmly anchored than hers. The following Monday, after a weekend where the Queen Bee sat powerless and increasingly forlorn at its dock. A sleek, serious-looking man in a suit that cost more than my first boat arrived at the marina. He introduced himself as Julian Vance, counsel for Mrs. Brenda Sterling. He was polite, professional, and radiated an aura of expensive damage control. He didn't waste time with bluster. "Mr. Henderson," he began, after Skipper had shown him into my office, "my client wishes to resolve this matter expediently." I nodded. "That has always been my preference. Mr. Vance," he slid a file across my desk, "Mrs. Sterling disputes certain interpretations of the events. However, in the interest of neighborly relations," he paused, a slight grimace betraying the absurdity of the phrase in this context, "she is prepared to offer a settlement for the claimed damages to your equipment and the Cove." The offer was about 70% of my documented claim. "As for the marina fees and service suspension," Vance continued, "we believe those are punitive and disproportionate." I leaned back. "Mr. Vance, the damages are not open to interpretation. They are documented with photographic and video evidence, along with professional appraisals. The full amount is non-negotiable." I pushed his file back. "As for the marina fees, they are standard contractual penalties for breach, clearly outlined. They stand." Vance sighed, the practiced calm of a lawyer who knew he had a weak hand and a difficult client. "Mr. Henderson, my client is prepared to be reasonable." "But reasonable," I interjected, keeping my voice mild, "would have been an apology and an offer to pay for damages the day it happened, Mrs. Sterling. Failing that, reasonable would have been addressing the first legal notice. We are several steps beyond that now." I then played my next card. "Should we be unable to reach an agreement on restitution and outstanding fees by, say, Wednesday close of business, I will have no alternative but to engage the harbor master to enforce a maritime lien against the Queen Bee for recovery of debts incurred and damages caused within this port. That process, as you know, can be quite public and rather sticky for the vessel owner." Vance's composure flickered. A maritime lien was serious. It attached to the vessel itself, regardless of owner, and could lead to its arrest and eventual auction. The involvement of the harbor master, a neutral but potent authority, would legitimize my claim beyond any doubt and strip away Brenda's ability to frame this as a personal vendetta. He knew I had him, and more importantly, he knew I knew. "Let me confer with my client," he said stiffly. "I would recommend she see sense," I replied, my tone still even. "The tide is going out on her options, Mr. Vance." This was the critical juncture, where the reluctant arm of officialdom would be brought to bear, not through coercion, but through the undeniable weight of evidence and due process. Brenda's little HOA kingdom was about to collide with the full force of maritime law. The deadline approached. Wednesday afternoon, the air in the Marina office was thick with anticipation. Skipper kept glancing at the clock, then out at slip at 12 where the Queen Bee sat, a silent monument to its owner's folly. At 4:52 p.m., precisely 8 minutes before my self-imposed deadline to call the harbor master, Mr. Vance appeared, looking harried. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Henderson," he said, placing a cashier's check on my desk, "this covers the full amount for damages as itemized, and all accrued marina fees to date." He slid a second document over. "This is a mutual release, stipulating no further action from either party on this specific matter, and no admission of liability on Mrs. Sterling's part." I reviewed the check. It was correct. I picked up the release, read it carefully. Standard boilerplate. I signed it. "Skipper," I called out, "you can restore services to slip at 12. Vance visibly relaxed. "My client will be making arrangements to depart your marina at the earliest opportunity." "Excellent," I said. Henderson Marina prides itself on efficient turnover. He gave a curt nod and departed, a man clearly glad to be extricating his client from a mess of her own making. The public reckoning, as it turned out, was quieter than I'd imagined, but no less complete. There would be no dramatic seizure by the harbor master, no news crews. But the story was already rippling through the community. Brenda Sterling, the iron-fisted HOA president, had been forced to pay a substantial sum for damages caused by her arrogance. Her attempt to bully someone outside her jurisdiction had cost her dearly, not just in money, but in the currency she valued most: perceived authority. Later that evening, Skipper brought in a printout from a local online forum. A thread titled, "HOA President's Yacht in Hot Water," was buzzing. Details were vague, but the narrative of an overreach met with firm resistance was clear. Anonymous commenters, likely HOA members, were expressing sentiments ranging from "about time someone stood up to her" to "maybe she'll stick to regulating lawn height now." Her power, built on intimidation, was eroding under the public gaze. The documents, my carefully compiled evidence, the legal notices, the Marina agreement, even her own ridiculous HOA citation, had formed an unbreachable wall against her attacks and a battering ram against her defenses. There was no grand exposure of systemic corruption, just the clean, sharp dismantling of one bully's misplaced sense of entitlement. The departure of the Queen Bee was an inglorious affair. No triumphant sailing out, just a quiet, almost furtive exit at dawn the next morning. I watched from my office window, a mug of coffee in hand. The vessel, usually so brazen, seemed to slide out of the marina with a kind of subdued humility. Good riddance. The financial settlement was already earmarked. A significant portion would go to restoring the oyster beds in the Cove, a task I'd entrust to marine biologists. The rest would cover my damaged equipment and then some, a tidy sum that felt less like profit and more like reparations. The most satisfying consequence, however, unfolded a few weeks later at the Seaview Palms HOA annual meeting. According to Pops, who had a cousin on the board, small town, deep roots, the agenda was unexpectedly hijacked. A motion of no confidence was brought against Brenda Sterling, citing a pattern of overreach and actions bringing the association into disrepute. The incident with my Marina was Exhibit A, presented not by me, but by other fed-up homeowners who had finally found their courage. Brenda, stripped of her bluster and facing a room full of emboldened neighbors, was voted out of her presidency in a landslide. The news brought a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about my Cove anymore. It was about a community freeing itself from petty tyranny. My actions had, inadvertently, provided the spark. I thought about the moral cost. Had I been too harsh? Too unyielding? I looked out at the Cove, where the first signs of recovery were already visible as new marker buoys, funded by Brenda's payment, bobbed gently. No. I had simply enforced boundaries that should never have been crossed. I had used the law, the rules of property, and contract, with surgical precision. It was a cold, calculated campaign, but the cause was just. The protection of one's sanctuary, one's legacy, sometimes required a steely resolve. The symbolic revenge was sweet, her funds restoring what her arrogance had damaged. The local corruption, such as it was, wasn't a shadowy network, but the simple, everyday abuse of minor power, which had been exposed and neutralized by the straightforward application of existing laws. The fight had been costly in time and mental energy, but the peace restored was worth it. The marina was quieter now, the unspoken tension lifted. The Cove, my Cove, was slowly returning to its former tranquility. The new oyster spat was taking hold, the water clearing. I cast a line from my skiff, the familiar weight of the rod a comfort. The Lucky Lucy jig, repaired and resilient, arced through the morning air and landed with a soft plip. It wasn't just about the fishing, or the oysters, or even the property line. It was about the principle of the thing. Brenda Sterling had sailed her yacht, a vessel of vanity, into a place of peace, believing her self-importance was a universal currency. She learned, at considerable expense, that some territories are not open to hostile takeover, especially by those armed only with delusions of grandeur. My victory wasn't loud. There were no parades, no public apologies forced from her. Justice, in this case, was a quiet equation balancing out, a restoration of order. The final lock on the gate, metaphorically speaking, was the knowledge that she understood, finally, that actions have consequences, and that not all Henderson was as pliable as she might have wished. The porch light of my control over my domain burned steadily, a beacon against future incursions. My inner monologue, once a tactical war room, was now quiet, observing the gentle lap of water against the hull. The relentless pacing of the past few weeks had given way to the slower rhythm of the tides. There was a somber resilience in that, a protective loyalty to this piece of water that had been affirmed. The world is full of Brendas, in big ways and small, people who mistake authority for power, rules for wisdom. Sometimes, all it takes is one person drawing a line in the sand, or in this case, the water, and holding it. The satisfaction was not in her defeat, but in the reaffirmation of that simple boundary. She thought her HOA badge gave her dominion. She forgot that the sea, like truth, has its own immutable laws, and those who disrespect them often find themselves wrecked upon the shores of their own arrogance. The fish weren't biting yet, but that was fine. Some days, the quiet itself was the catch.